In a world where money can buy everything except hope, a poor mechanic's heart changes the life of a billionaire and his paralyzed daughter. This is a story of courage, kindness, and a miracle built by hand. Watch till the end, because sometimes the smallest act of compassion can create the biggest miracle. Like, share, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Richard Hayes was a man everyone in New York City knew. A billionaire whose name appeared in magazines, business awards, and charity galas. His wealth came from technology, his empire spanning across the globe. But behind the glittering success and elegant suits, there was a sadness no one saw. His daughter, Amelia Hayes, only 19, had been paralyzed after a terrible car accident 2 years ago. Since that day, his mansion felt like a tomb. No laughter, no music, just the sound of doctors, nurses, and quiet despair that haunted every corner of his luxurious home. Amelia had once been full of life, a dancer who loved music and sunsets by the Hudson River. She used to spin around the living room, her laughter filling every space. Now she sat silently in her wheelchair, staring out of tall glass windows, watching others live what she had lost. Richard hired the best doctors, flew specialists from Europe, even invested in experimental surgeries. Nothing worked. Each failure crushed him a little more. His billions couldn't buy back his daughter's joy, and that truth burned deeper than any business loss he'd ever faced. Every morning began the same way. Amelia's nurse rolled her to the garden, where she'd sit quietly under the same oak tree, reading the same book she never finished. Richard watched from his office window, guilt twisting inside him. He blamed himself for not being there the night of the accident, for always being too busy chasing success. He'd trade all his fortune to see her stand just once again, but no amount of money could heal what science couldn't fix. The emptiness inside him grew with every sunrise. One spring morning, Richard was on his way to an urgent investor meeting when fate decided to intervene. His black limousine glided through a quiet suburban area when the engine suddenly coughed and died. The chauffeur tried to restart it, but smoke began rising from under the hood. Annoyed and impatient, Richard stepped out of the car, pulling out his phone to call for another ride. Amelia sat quietly inside, watching her father pace the roadside, clearly irritated. That's when a young man across the street noticed their trouble and jogged over. The man wore a faded grey t-shirt, grease-stained jeans, and work boots. His hands were covered in oil, but his smile was warm. "Need a hand, sir?" he asked. Richard looked at him, slightly taken aback by his confidence. The young man introduced himself as Ethan Cole, a local mechanic who ran the nearby garage. Without waiting for permission, Ethan popped open the limo's hood and began checking the engine. His movements were quick and sure. Richard watched silently, still frowning, but something about the young man's attitude felt strangely genuine. Amelia watched him through the car window. There was something different about Ethan. His eyes weren't filled with pity when he glanced at her wheelchair. Instead, he smiled and waved. "Hey there, kiddo," he said softly. "Don't worry, we'll get you moving again in no time." Amelia's lips twitched into a small smile, the first in months. It startled Richard. He hadn't seen her react like that to anyone in so long. Somehow this poor mechanic managed to do what all the therapists and doctors couldn't, make her feel human again, even for a moment. As Ethan worked, he chatted casually with Amelia. He asked her about the book she was reading, and she shyly replied. They laughed quietly together. Richard stood aside, arms crossed, watching this young man covered in grease joke with his daughter like they were old friends. When Ethan finally fixed the problem, he wiped his hands and gave Richard a polite nod. "She's all good to go, sir. Just a loose connection." Richard took out his wallet, offering a thick roll of bills, but Ethan shook his head. "No need, sir. Happy to help." That answer stunned Richard. People always wanted something from him: money, connections, favors. No one had refused him in years. But Ethan did, and he meant it. Richard hesitated before saying, "At least let me pay you for your time." Ethan smiled again and said, "Time's all I have, sir." "It's free." Amelia chuckled at his words, and for the first time Richard smiled too. As they drove away, He caught a glimpse of Ethan in the rearview mirror, walking back to his small garage, wiping sweat from his brow. That evening, Amelia wouldn't stop talking about him. She told her father how kind Ethan was, how he didn't look at her like she was broken. Richard listened, surprised by her energy. It had been so long since he'd seen her excited about anything. Later that night, while sitting in his study surrounded by silence, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the young mechanic. There was something special about his humility, something genuine that money couldn't imitate. A thought crossed his mind. Maybe fate had introduced them for a reason. The next morning, Richard made a decision that felt uncharacteristic for a man of his stature. Instead of going to his usual board meetings, he told his driver to take him back to that same street, the little auto shop where Ethan worked. The sign above the door read Cole's Garage. He stepped out of his car in an expensive suit, looking completely out of place among old tires and rusty tools. Inside, Ethan was busy welding a piece of metal, sparks flying around him. When he looked up and saw Richard, he smiled, genuinely surprised. And that's where their unlikely friendship began. When Richard stepped into the small garage, the smell of oil and burnt metal filled the air. It was a far cry from the clean marble halls of his mansion, yet something about the place felt alive. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and walked over with a friendly grin. "Did the car break down again, sir?" he joked. Richard shook his head. "No, I came to thank you properly," he said sincerely. Ethan's smile softened, and he offered him a seat on an old stool. It was the start of a conversation that would change both their lives. Richard told Ethan how much it meant that he'd spoken kindly to Amelia. "She hasn't laughed like that in years," he admitted. Ethan's expression turned thoughtful. "My little sister used to be like her," he said quietly. "She lost her ability to walk after an accident too. I tried everything to help her, built small gadgets, braces, anything I could, but she passed before I could finish." His voice wavered slightly, but he continued. "Since then, I've always wanted to help someone walk again. Maybe this time I can finish what I started." Those words struck something deep in Richard's heart. A man who had everything in the world stood before someone who had lost everything, but somehow Ethan had more hope than he did. Richard leaned forward, curious. "You think you could actually help Amelia?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been studying robotics at night online. I might be able to make something. A powered leg brace that helps her move with support." Richard hesitated. Every doctor had failed. Every specialist had disappointed him. But something about Ethan's confidence felt different. It wasn't science. It was sincerity. A few days later, Richard brought Amelia to the garage. She was nervous, clutching her book in her lap as her wheelchair rolled over the uneven floor. Ethan greeted her with his usual bright smile. "Hey there, partner," he said cheerfully. "You ready to help me build something amazing?" She smiled shyly and nodded. Richard watched as the two began sketching rough designs on a dusty workbench. Ethan explained every part patiently, using simple words so Amelia could understand. For the first time in years, Richard saw his daughter not as a patient, but as a partner in something beautiful. Days turned into weeks. Ethan spent every waking hour in that small garage, surrounded by wires, motors, and metal scraps. He barely slept, surviving on black coffee and determination. Amelia visited daily, often bringing sandwiches and cheering him on. She started smiling more, laughing louder, asking questions about the tools and circuits. Richard saw her transform before his eyes. The light that had dimmed inside her since the accident was glowing again. Ethan didn't just repair machines, he was repairing hearts, one small act of kindness at a time. One night, Richard stopped by unannounced. He found Ethan asleep on his workbench, metal parts scattered everywhere. On a nearby sheet of paper lay detailed sketches of mechanical legs, full of notes and equations. Richard quietly covered him with his coat and looked around the messy garage. There were no expensive tools or high-tech equipment, just one man's raw determination. In that moment, Richard realized that miracles don't come from money or luxury. They come from effort, from love, from a person who refuses to give up. It humbled him deeply. The first prototype was finally built, a pair of robotic leg braces powered by small electric motors. They were heavy and imperfect, but they represented hope. When Ethan showed them to Amelia, her eyes lit up. "You really made these for me?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded with a grin. "You're my first test pilot." Richard watched quietly, his throat tightening. For months, he had seen Amelia only through medical lenses. Charts, diagnoses, limitations. But now she looked alive, excited, full of courage. He knew they were standing on the edge of something extraordinary. The test didn't go well. When Amelia tried to move, the braces were too heavy. The motors buzzed, then stopped. She stumbled and nearly fell, but Ethan caught her just in time. "I'm sorry," he muttered, frustrated. "It's too much weight." Amelia smiled weakly. "You tried. That means something." But when she looked at him, she saw the disappointment in his eyes. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in the dark garage staring at his sketches. He refused to quit. He whispered to himself, "I promised I'd help her walk. I won't fail again." The next morning, Richard arrived with coffee and breakfast. Ethan looked exhausted but still determined. "I know what went wrong," he said immediately. "The braces need lighter material, something like carbon fiber." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we'll get it," he said. Ethan shook his head. "That stuff's expensive." "I can't let you—" But Richard interrupted firmly. "This isn't charity, Ethan. It's partnership." The mechanic hesitated, then finally accepted. Together, they went to a supplier and bought the materials. For the first time, the billionaire and the mechanic worked side by side as equals, bound by purpose. Over the next week, the garage became a workshop of hope. Amelia sat on a stool, helping sand metal edges and holding tools for Ethan. Richard often arrived with dinner, sometimes just to watch them laugh and build. The sound of laughter and hammering filled the air. It was the sound of healing. Ethan worked tirelessly, his hands blistered, his eyes tired but bright. Every night he'd whisper, "We're getting closer, Amelia." She believed him completely, and deep down, Richard knew something miraculous was being built right before his eyes. Not just for his daughter, but for all of them. After weeks of relentless effort, Ethan finally stood back and looked at what he had built. The new braces gleamed under the dim light of his garage, lighter, sleeker, stronger. He could hardly believe they were made from scraps, hard work, and faith. When he sent a message to Richard saying, "It's ready," his hands trembled. That night he didn't sleep. He cleaned the floor, wiped every tool, and rehearsed every safety step in his mind. Tomorrow wasn't just another test. It was the moment everything they had worked for would either break or bloom into a miracle. The next morning, Richard's car pulled up outside the garage. The air was cool and filled with nervous energy. Amelia sat quietly in her wheelchair, eyes wide with anticipation. Ethan greeted them with his familiar warm smile, but even he couldn't hide the emotion in his eyes. "You ready, Amelia?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice trembling. "I've been ready since the day I met you." Richard's heart squeezed. His daughter, once hopeless, now spoke with courage and joy. He knew, no matter what happened, she'd already found her strength again. Ethan carefully lifted the metallic braces and knelt beside Amelia, adjusting them around her legs. His hands were gentle but sure, his movements full of focus. He tightened the straps, checked the small motors, and connected the battery pack. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of electricity. Richard stood nearby, unable to breathe. Amelia gripped the handles on her chair, looking down at her legs. "Are you sure this will work?" she whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "I don't know, but I believe in you more than anything." When the final switch flipped, a soft mechanical sound filled the air. The braces vibrated slightly as the motors came to life. Ethan looked up at Amelia and gave a small nod. "Try to stand," he said. Slowly, with trembling arms, she pushed against the sides of her chair. Her legs shivered under the weight, the motors adjusted, and then, miraculously, she began to rise. Inch by inch, she lifted herself upright, her entire body shaking. Richard gasped, covering his mouth. "Oh, my God," he whispered. Amelia stood, tears streaming down her face. "I'm standing!" she cried. Ethan's eyes glistened as he steadied her shoulders. "Now take a step," he said quietly. Amelia hesitated, terrified of falling. Ethan stayed beside her, ready to catch her. She shifted her weight, and her right foot moved forward just an inch, but it was everything. The motor responded, supporting her motion. Then another step. Then another. Richard couldn't hold it in anymore. He broke down completely, falling to his knees, tears streaming freely. "You did it, sweetheart. You did it," he cried out, his voice breaking with pride and disbelief. Amelia laughed through her tears, turning toward her father. "Dad, I'm walking," she shouted joyfully, taking another wobbly step. Ethan looked on silently, emotion overwhelming him. The sight of her moving on her own, even imperfectly, was everything he had ever dreamed of. Richard rushed forward, embracing her tightly, afraid to let go. It was a scene that captured pure humanity, pain, love, and triumph, all in one fragile moment. Outside, a couple walking their dog stopped and filmed the scene from the street, unaware they were recording something that would soon inspire millions. When the video went viral, the internet exploded with emotion. People from all over the country sent messages, donations, and letters of support. News stations replayed the moment on repeat. A billionaire's daughter walking for the first time, thanks to a poor mechanic's invention. But for Ethan, none of the fame mattered. He stayed humble, still fixing cars and helping neighbors. Richard, on the other hand, knew he had been changed forever. For the first time in his life, he felt what it truly meant to give, not just to spend. A few months later, Richard held a press conference in a large hall. Reporters, doctors, and engineers filled the seats. On stage beside Amelia stood Ethan, uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, yet glowing with quiet pride. Richard took the microphone and announced, "Today we are launching the Cole Foundation, named after the man who reminded me that miracles come from ordinary hearts." The crowd erupted in applause. Ethan spoke briefly, his voice steady. "Sometimes what needs fixing isn't the machine, it's the heart behind it." The hall went silent, moved by the truth in his words. Years passed. The Walker braces, named in Ethan's honor, became a symbol of hope worldwide. Hospitals used the design to help thousands of disabled children walk again. Ethan still worked in his small garage, never seeking fame, only purpose. Richard often visited, not as a billionaire, but as a friend. Amelia, now healthy and confident, volunteered at hospitals, showing kids how to believe in themselves. Every time she took a step, she remembered that young mechanic who refused to give up on her. Their story became more than a miracle. It became a message to the world. One crisp autumn afternoon, Amelia returned to that same garage. Ethan was fixing a car, music playing softly in the background. She tapped his shoulder, smiling. "You know, this place still smells like oil and miracles," she teased. Ethan laughed. "And you still walk better than my car runs." They both smiled warmly. Across town, a plaque outside the Cole Foundation read, "Built not by wealth, but by heart." The story of a billionaire, a poor mechanic, and a once paralyzed girl lived on. Proof that kindness can build what money never could. Hope, faith and love that lasts forever. As the years passed, Ethan's kindness continued to touch countless lives. What began in a small garage became a symbol of hope for the world. Amelia walks with confidence, and Richard smiles, knowing that one man's heart changed everything. Remember, true wealth isn't measured by money, but by the lives we lift. If this story moved your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and keep spreading kindness wherever you go.